Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into a complex and often quite difficult piece of history.
Yeah, definitely.
We're looking at French colonialism, but specifically the kind of overlapping stories across Black Africa. So French West Africa, French Equatorial Africa, and then Algeria. Very different contexts.
Exactly. That's the key thing to grasp right away.
Our goal here is to unpack the sources, follow the trail from the initial, often brutal conquest through how they actually ran these places.
Administrative machinery, yeah.
Right, the administration, the economics, even some pretty dark political stuff in the interwar years, and then track how these structures, these systems, actually lasted, often invisibly, way past formal independence.
And it's crucial, like you said, to see these aren't just one story. AOF and AEF, French West, and Equatorial Africa, that was one kind of colonial project. Largely bureaucratic, focused on extraction.
Okay.
Algeria, though. Totally different beast. That was settler colonialism, driven by ideology, by the European population there. The sources show really distinct methods, distinct goals.
So that sets up our main question for this deep dive, doesn't it? How on earth did France manage these huge, incredibly diverse territories, especially with such different models operating side by side? And maybe more importantly for us today, what specific things, political structures, economic ties, even cultural habits did they build that were so strong they just kept going after the flags changed?
That's the core of it. What endured beyond the formal empire?
Okay, let's start at the beginning then, the foundation.
Yeah.
We have to talk about the violence, specifically in Black Africa around the Niger River. The sources suggest a real turning point, a moment where diplomacy just got shoved aside.
Oh, absolutely. There was a definite shift. France had been present, through trade, exerting pressure, and it helped that the big local powers like the Tokolar Empire were already weakening internally.
Right.
But there's this phrase that comes up in the material: the moment the velvet glove of diplomacy was pulled off the mailed fist, it was stark.
And the trigger for that, the specific action, seems to be Colonel Archinard's move on Ségou, the Tokolar capital. What's really striking is the sources say he didn't really have permission, did he? No clear orders from Paris, no major immediate threat.
That's completely right, and it tells you a lot about how the empire was actually built on the ground.
Oh.
Archinard acted unilaterally in 1890. He just decided to go in and smash what was left of the Tokolar state.
Wow.
And by doing that, without waiting for Paris, he basically committed France to a path of total military conquest in that region. It set a precedent, really, for how AOF and AEF would be consolidated. Aggressive action first, sort the politics out later.
So if the conquest was driven by these sort of rogue military figures, what kind of government did they eventually put in place? You mentioned this centralized system, but also paralyzed. How did that work?
It's a real paradox, isn't it? The absolute linchpin was the Governor General, the GG, based in, say, Dakar for West Africa or Brazzaville for Equatorial Africa. This figure had just immense power delegated from Paris.
Like, what could they actually do?
Well, almost everything short of declaring war themselves. They didn't just apply the law, they could interpret it. And critically, they could issue internal administrative regulation.
How powerful were those regulations compared to actual laws from France?
The sources say they were often as important as the original law. Think about that. The guy on the ground could essentially make rules with the force of law within the colony.
Okay.
Plus, the GG could impose nearly any tax they wanted except import tariffs. Paris kept control of those, and they could create state monopolies over certain goods or industries. It made them incredibly powerful locally.
So where did that leave the actual Minister of Colonies back in Paris? You'd think they'd be in charge, but...
You would think, but, the reality was the Minister of Colonies' portfolio was seen as kind of secondary importance in the French cabinet. It shows you where the colonies really ranked. And their actual power over the GG was surprisingly limited. For example, the minister couldn't even communicate directly with the lieutenant governors running the individual territories within the AOF or AEF federations.
Wait, really? How did that work then?
All communication, all directives had to go through the Governor General's office.
Ah, so the GG controlled the information flow completely, both ways.
Exactly. A massive bottleneck and a massive source of power for the GG. They could shape how Paris understood the situation and how Paris's instructions were implemented, or maybe not implemented.
Was there any real check on the GG from Paris?
The main one, on paper, was finance. The GG had to submit the entire colonial budget as one single block on block. The minister could then approve the whole thing or reject the whole thing.
Okay, rejecting the entire budget sounds like a pretty big weapon, doesn't it? Even if you can't fiddle with the details.
It does, but think about the implications. It was such an extreme measure. Do you risk shutting down the entire administration for a whole year, causing chaos just because you dislike one part of the budget?
Probably not.
Right. It created this all-or-nothing situation that, ironically, often just strengthened the GG's hand. They knew Paris would likely blink rather than cause a total meltdown. So the system looked centralized, but was prone to this kind of paralysis and local autonomy.
Let's shift gears a bit from the nuts and bolts of administration to the ideology, this famous French idea of cultural assimilation. It sounds noble, but the sources suggest the reality, especially with education before World War II, was, well, pretty different.
Oh, massively different. There's this huge gap between the rhetoric, this talk of making Africans into Frenchmen, and what actually happened on the ground.
So what was the purpose of education then, if not assimilation?
The explicit goal, particularly for any education beyond the very basic primary level, was purely vocational. It was designed by the administration quite deliberately to produce the low-level workers they needed.
Like clerks.
Interpreters. Exactly. The cadres, they called them. Just enough education to be useful cogs in the colonial machine, but not enough to challenge the system.
So definitely not about creating equal citizens.
Not at all. And access to higher education to really engage with French culture. Extremely limited. The sources talk about only a rare few outstanding students getting sent to France. Léopold Senghor is mentioned as a famous example, but he was truly exceptional.
You were basically handpicking a tiny, loyal elite.
Precisely. It feels less like a genuine attempt at assimilation that failed, and more like a policy designed for administrative convenience while keeping the vast majority of the population at arm's length culturally.
And they actively discouraged other forms of learning, too.
Yes. French was the official language, the language of instruction in the few schools that existed, but very little effort was made to actually spread French language or culture widely. And other schools, like the Quranic schools common in Muslim areas, were often actively suppressed or discouraged.
The outcome sounds pretty damning. The sources say only a minority ended up speaking French, and many of those spoke it badly.
It really undermines the whole stated mission, doesn't it? If assimilation was the goal, it was a spectacular failure. But if the goal was limited control and maintaining difference, then maybe it wasn't a failure from the administration's point of view. It left this huge gap between the official ideology and the lived reality for most people.
Okay, so we have this picture of a centralized but also quite detached and exclusionary administration. Now let's look at why it was structured that way. Economics. The sources use this term benign neglect, which sounds odd.
It's a very loaded term, isn't it? Benign neglect. It was neglectful, certainly, if you were thinking about developing diversified local economies or industries for Africans.
Right.
But it was anything but neglectful when it came to getting out the resources France wanted. Development, such as it was almost entirely focused on export crops, peanuts, cotton, rubber, timber things needed by French industry, and building just enough infrastructure, like railways, to get those raw materials to the ports.
So French needs first, last, and always.
Absolutely paramount. And it wasn't just about resources. The colonies were actually taxed to help France's own budget problems, especially after World War I.
They were sending money back to France.
Yes. The sources give a specific example. In 1927, French West Africa, AOF, contributed nearly 20 million francs, 19.4 million, a huge sum then directly to the French national budget.
Wow.
It wasn't just about being self-sufficient. They were actively subsidizing the metropole. Governor General Card summed up the attitude perfectly. Our duty is clear. France calls, we respond.
Given this absolute focus on France's needs, it's probably no surprise that big plans for, actually developing the colonies themselves often went nowhere, like the Sorrow Plan in 1921.
Ah, the Sorrow Plan. Yes, that's a classic example. On paper, it looked great. Really ambitious. Proposed integrated economic development, building proper infrastructure, roads, railways, the works funded by guaranteed loans from France.
Sounds like a real commitment. What went wrong?
Politics. The French National Assembly actually voted to accept the plan in principle. Everyone patted themselves on the back. Great vision.
But
then they simply refused to vote for the money needed to actually do it.
seriously.
Seriously. It was approved in theory, starved of funds in practice, dead on arrival. It just highlights that France was fundamentally unwilling to invest significant capital in its African territories. The profit had to flow one way.
So if Paris wouldn't pay, and development still needed to happen at least enough to get resources out, where did the money and labor come from? This brings us to the really brutal stuff, right? Forced labor, the concession system, especially in French Equatorial Africa, the AEF.
This is where benign neglect becomes a truly grotesque understatement. The concession system in the AEF, particularly the Congo region, was infamous.
How widespread was it?
Get this. In just a few months, between March and July 1899, France handed out 30-year concessions to 40 different private companies. These concessions covered almost 70% of the entire territory of the Congo.
70% given to private companies.
Yes. And this was after massive scandals involving earlier concession companies, names like Verdier, Dommage, Chatelier pop up, where the abuses were so bad they led to huge payouts or the concessions being regranted. They knew the system was prone to horror, but they doubled down.
So these companies basically owned vast areas and the people living there.
Effectively, yes. And the French colonial administration wasn't just standing by, they were actively helping the companies exploit the land and the people. They used the state's power.
How?
Several ways. The poll tax was everywhere, forcing people into the cash economy. Compulsory cultivation, forcing communities to grow specific cash crops for export, whether they wanted to or not. Forced deliveries of goods at artificially low prices set by the administration. And, crucially, forced unpaid labor requisitioning people to work on roads, railways, or directly for the concession companies.
You mentioned earlier an administrative incentive for this, ruthlessness. Something about a circular from Commissioner Gentile.
Yes, Gentile's 1903 circular. It's chilling because it formalized the pressure. It explicitly said that an administrator's promotion prospects depended on how much tax revenue they collected in their district.
So collect more taxes, get promoted faster.
Exactly. A direct incentive for brutality. And the sources say taxes were often jacked up 2 or 3 times in a row just to meet these targets.
Were taxes sometimes used just to control people's economic lives, not even primarily for revenue?
Absolutely. There's a specific example from the Congolese coast, a tax imposed on traditional salt houses. Locals had ways of extracting salt from brine. The tax wasn't really about the money. It was designed to make their traditional method uneconomical, forcing them to buy imported salt sold by the French companies, destroying local self-sufficiency to create a captive market.
And all this movement of goods, without proper roads or railways in many places, relied on people carrying stuff, porterage.
Yes, and the human cost was immense. Porterage was one of the deadliest aspects of the system, carrying heavy loads for hundreds of miles, often with little food or support. The sources note that even things like the freedom villages set up by the military, which sound positive, were often just a way to gather and control populations needed for porterage.
So, not about freedom at all.
Not really, and when they try to reform in 1904, talking about replacing forced porters with professional porters, it was just a paper reform. Nobody wanted the job voluntarily because it was so brutal and deadly, and the forced laborers just deserted whenever they could. The whole economic system in the AEF particularly rested on this foundation of forced deadly labor.
Okay, let's make that big pivot now. We've seen the bureaucratic extractor model in Black Africa. Now, Algeria, totally different situation. Here, it wasn't just a distant administration calling the shots. It was this powerful, deeply entrenched European settler community, the Colons.
And this is such a crucial contrast, moving from the sort of cold administrative violence of the Congo concessions to the hot ideological hatred you see boiling up in cities like Oran and Algiers among the settlers. It really shows the different logics at play.
Right.
In AOFAF, the main goal seemed to be efficient control and resource extraction from afar. But Algeria was different. It was legally part of France and not just a colony. For the settlers, the goal was permanent domination, protecting their privileges, keeping the native Algerian population absolutely subordinate. And this environment gave rise to what the sources explicitly call colonial fascism.
How is this colonial fascism distinct from what was happening in Italy or Germany at the time?
It shared some features, definitely intense xenophobia, virulent anti-Semitism, hatred of democracy in parliament, a love of militarism, action over thought. All that was there. But its specific colonial flavor was that its primary aim was to rigidly define colonial difference, to constantly reinforce the idea that the Muslim population, the indigenes, were fundamentally different and inferior and absolutely should be kept in their place. Fascism here was a tool to buttress the colonial system itself and intensify the exploitation of Algerians.
And the sources are really clear that anti-Semitism was like the main weapon used to rally the European settlers together.
Oh, it was absolutely central. It was the glue that held the diverse European settler population French, Spanish, Italian, Maltese together. They might have distrusted each other, but they could unite in hating the Jews.
Even though, as the sources point out, most Algerian Jews weren't wealthy.
Exactly. The rhetoric had little to do with reality. Most Algerian Jews lived in poverty or were shopkeepers, artisans,
Right.
but they were portrayed in the settler press with this incredibly vicious, dehumanizing language parasites, a cancer, vermin.
Well, why was the political calculation?
Because it worked. Figures like Gabriel Lambert, leading a group called the RNAS, the Rassemblement National d'Action Sociale, they understood that anti-Semitism was the easiest way to mobilize mass support among the settlers. They weren't just having meetings. The RNAS openly threatened to start a veritable civil war in Oran over Jewish rights.
And the French authorities? The police? They weren't neutral bystanders.
Far from it. There's clear evidence of state complicity, even active participation. Again, in Oran, the municipal police and even officers are documented brutally suppressing demonstrations by left-wing groups or Jewish organizations defending themselves.
Brutally.
Yes, the sources mention extreme brutality towards Jews specifically, and even, quote, a police superior shouting to his men during a crackdown, Allez frappez fort, go on and hit them hard. That's the state actively enabling fascist violence.
It wasn't just one single fascist movement, though, was it? There were different flavors, groups from mainland France, but also unique Algerian ones.
That's right. You had imports like Action Française, the monarchist anti-Semitic group from France. Their whole message blaming Jews, Protestants, Masons, and foreigners was basically tailor-made, as the sources say, for the paranoid settler mindset.
Right.
But then you had purely local creations, like the Union Latine in Oran. They combined the fascist cult of the leader and hatred of democracy with this specific Algerianist ideology, the idea that the European settlers were a new, superior Latin race destined to rule Algeria forever.
And even the big mainstream right-wing movements from France had to adapt to the Algerian context. They couldn't just import their French program.
They absolutely had to adapt, often by becoming much more extreme. Look at the PSF, the Parti Social Français. It grew out of the Croix de Feu, a huge nationalist league in France, over 1 million members by 1938. Their leader in France, Colonel de la Roque, had a kind of social Catholic angle.
But in Algeria,
The Algerian branches basically told him to get lost with the social Catholic stuff. They completely gave in to local settler pressure and embraced virulent anti-Semitism because that's what got votes and members in Algeria.
and the PPF, the Parti Populaire Français, another fascist group.
Similar story. Initially, the PTF leadership in France hesitated about going full-on anti-Semitic. Membership in Algeria plummeted, so local leaders quickly changed tack. The PPF boss in Algeria, Arrighi, started declaring Jews were foreigners on our soil whose rights had to be stripped. Suddenly, membership soared again. They followed the local hate.
These weren't just fringe groups shouting, though. They could actually challenge the state, couldn't they? The Front Paysan incident in 1935 seems key.
The Peasant Front campaign, yeah. That's fascinating because it wasn't initially about ideology, but economic settler farmers protesting about agricultural debt.
So what did they do?
Their tactic was genius, in a way. They organized mass resignations of elected settler officials across the board, mayors, councilors. They just quit en masse to paralyze the local government.
How effective was that?
Hugely effective. In the Constantine region alone, 35 out of 64 mayors resigned. Think about that. Plus tons of councilors.
Wow. 35 mayors. Why did that force Paris's hand?
Because it showed who really held the power locally. The French administration couldn't function without the cooperation of the settler politicians and administrators. When they walked out, the system ground to a halt. Paris had no choice but to cave in on the debt issue and give the settlers what they wanted. It was a stark reminder that in Algeria, settler power could, and often did, trump central authority.
Okay, World War II arrives, and like everywhere, it shakes things up dramatically for the French Empire. Let's jump to 1944, the Brazzaville Conference. It gets talked about a lot, sometimes as the start of independence.
It does get talked about that way, and there's this enduring image, particularly among some African nationalists, of de Gaulle as the sort of godfather of independence, because he called this conference.
But the reality, according to the sources, was a bit more cautious.
Much more cautious. De Gaulle's main goal at Brazzaville wasn't granting independence. It was about asserting his leadership of Free France, showing the Allies, especially the U.S., that he controlled a significant territory, unlike Vichy. It was about legitimacy for him and Free France.
So what was on the table and what was explicitly off the table?
Looking closely at the speeches, the documents, reform was discussed. evolution within the French system. But independence, certainly any kind of independence outside of what they called a permanent French context, was absolutely ruled out. De Gaulle was clear on that.
But even so, just holding the conference, just talking about change,
Yeah.
that must have had an impact.
Oh, undeniably. Regardless of the limited official scope, the conference aroused expectations of change across French Africa. People heard the talk of reform and started thinking bigger thoughts.
And this led pretty directly to some real political changes after the war, especially in Black Africa.
It did. One immediate, very significant change was that deputies from the African territories were elected to sit in the French National Assembly in Paris, theoretically as full and equal members.
So Africa was now represented directly in the French parliament?
Yes, under the idea that the colonies were now integral parts of this indivisible republic. And crucially, back in Africa, elected assemblies were set up in each territory.
Elected assemblies. With real power.
Well, initially, their power was mostly consultative. The real executive power still rested with the French governor appointed from Paris. But, and this is key, these assemblies were chosen through direct popular elections.
So people were actually voting for their own representatives for the first time on a large scale.
Exactly. And the sources argued that this process, these elections, these fledgling assemblies, even with limited power, marked the real beginnings of the political journey that led to independence just 15 years later. It created a political class, taught people how politics worked.
But this progress, this idea of becoming equal French citizens, eventually hit a wall, didn't it? The sources call it the dead end of theoretical equality.
Yeah, it's a fascinating dynamic. Once the African political elite achieved this theoretical equality, they were French citizens on paper, represented in Paris. They realized there was nowhere else to go within that system.
What do you mean?
Well, the goal had been assimilation, becoming French. But once they were technically French, they saw they still didn't have real power or autonomy. They couldn't improve their political status further as Frenchmen. The ceiling was still very low. They started thinking beyond assimilation.
And how did France react to this? The idea of potentially millions of Africans being fully equal citizens with voting rights.
That started to cause real anxiety back in France. The sources talk about this growing fear that 40 million metropolitan Frenchmen might get overwhelmed by their more numerous former colonial subjects if true equality was ever realized.
So the French themselves started backing away from the whole assimilation idea.
Pretty much. Interest in assimilation dropped off sharply. The goal subtly shifted from integration to finding ways to manage and contain the political aspirations of the colonies. It showed assimilation was only ever really meant for a tiny, controllable few.
Okay, so by the late 1950s, you have this growing frustration among the African elite, but also maybe a lack of deep preparation for actually running independent countries. The sources seem a bit contradictory here.
It's a bit of both. Administratively, many of the new states were unprepared in any practical sense when independence came in 1960. The Ivory Coast is given as an example. As late as 1956, it had literally 0 African civil servants in actual policymaking jobs.
0? Wow.
Yeah. But, on the other hand, that small, highly French-educated political elite figures we know well, like Houphouët-Boigny in Ivory Coast, Senghor in Senegal, they had gained absolutely invaluable experience. By serving for years in the French parliament, in French cabinets during the unstable Fourth Republic, and in those territorial assemblies we just talked about, they knew the French system inside out. They knew how to negotiate, how to legislate, how to politic. They were politically very sophisticated, even if the administrative structures beneath them were thin.
So the final steps towards independence. It's ironic that the politicians of the Fourth Republic who set up those assemblies and granted citizenship weren't the ones who actually granted independence.
No, it came back to de Gaulle. He returned to power in 1958, and he was the one who oversaw the final stages, dismantling the empire he had, as the sources put it, perhaps unwittingly, started to reform back at Brazzaville.
And figures like Houphouët-Boigny were key players in this final phase.
Hugely influential. Houphouët-Boigny especially came to dominate the main African political grouping, the RDA, particularly after he strategically broke ties with the French Communist Party in 1950, which made him much more acceptable to the French establishment. He had enormous sway in Paris.
So was independence basically forced on France, or did they eventually see it as being in their own interest?
It shifted towards the latter. By around 1957, you start seeing influential French figures like François Mitterrand arguing that France actually needed to end colonial domination precisely to preserve its long-term influence and relationships in Africa.
So grant independence on French terms to keep them in the French orbit?
Exactly. It was an acceptance that independence was inevitable, so it was better to manage the process and secure favorable post-colonial arrangements rather than fight losing battles. A strategic retreat, essentially.
So 1960 arrives. Independence for most of French Black Africa. New nations on the map. But as we discussed, many were artificial creations, right? Lines drawn on a map in Europe.
Absolutely. Borders drawn back in Berlin in 1885, often cutting right across ethnic groups, natural geographic boundaries. Just lines on a map designed for European convenience, not African realities. Inheriting these borders created huge challenges for national unity.
Yet the political system they inherited from France actually helped with that, in a strange way.
Paradoxically, yes. The French constitutional model, especially de Gaulle's Fifth Republic model, which influenced many of the new African constitutions, had this incredibly strong centralized presidency. An imperial presidency, some call it.
Like the power the governor general used to have?
Very similar, yes. And the sources suggest this highly centralized power structure was actually quite well suited to what they term traditional African leadership concepts of the strong chef. It provided a powerful central authority that could, theoretically, hold these diverse, artificially created states together.
So the colonial power structure lived on, just with a different person at the top.
In many ways, yes. It offered continuity and a tool for cohesion, even if it wasn't very democratic. But perhaps the most powerful, most enduring legacy wasn't political structure, but economic. We have to talk about the franc zone, the CFA franc.
Right. The sources call this the central pillar of France's continued presence. It's more than just sharing a currency, isn't it? It sounds quite restrictive.
Oh, it's incredibly restrictive. The mechanisms are designed quite explicitly to keep France in control and maintain its privileged position.
How does it work, specifically?
Okay, first, the currency itself isn't issued by the individual countries, but by two regional central banks heavily influenced by France. Second, the member countries give up a lot of economic sovereignty. They cannot issue their own national currency. They can't legally stop capital flowing out of their country to France. They can't decide to devalue or revalue their currency on their own that's tied to France, first the franc, now the euro.
So basic tools of national economic policy are just off the table.
Pretty much. And there's more. How much credit can expand in their economies is subject to limits set by treaty with France. And, crucially, they've historically been required to deposit a very large percentage, often 50% or more of their foreign currency reserves, into a special account at the French Treasury in Paris.
50% of their reserves held in Paris.
Why? It guarantees the convertibility of the CFA franc at a fixed rate, backed by France. But it also means France effectively holds veto power over their monetary policy and benefits from holding those reserves.
This system must have come under strain sometimes,
Yeah.
like in the late 80s.
It did, big time. There was a major crisis. The regional banks were running huge deficits with the French Treasury. Devaluation seemed economically necessary for the African countries, but France was incredibly reluctant to allow it.
Why?
Because they were terrified the whole system would unravel. If the fixed link was broken, France feared losing its monetary control, its guaranteed markets, its whole privileged economic relationship. So stability of the currency, prioritized by France, often came at the expense of the African economy's own adjustment needs.
It makes you look differently at acts of French generosity, doesn't it? Like canceling debt.
Absolutely. The sources highlight Mitterrand canceling 1/3 of the debt for the poorest franc zone countries in 1988. It was presented as aid, generosity. But the analysis points out it was also deep self-interest. France was already effectively carrying these countries' deficits because of the franc zone rules. Canceling debt they were unlikely to ever get back anyway cost France little in reality, but it bought political goodwill and reduced the French treasury's own financial exposure. Clever politics.
Beyond money, France also maintained influence through security ties, right? Bilateral agreements instead of some grand federation.
Yes, they ditched the idea of a formal confederation. Apparently, Houphouët-Boigny, among others, was strongly against any federal structure that might dilute his own power. So instead, France signed individual cooperation accords with almost all the newly independent states except Guinea, which had broken away completely.
And these accords included military clauses. How did that work without France keeping huge armies stationed everywhere?
It was quite a smart military concept, actually. The Corps was a rapid intervention force based in France, ready to deploy quickly. Then, in Africa itself, they just maintained small forward bases, strategically placed bridgeheads and supply depots, manned by small numbers of troops.
So launch pads for intervention rather than big garrisons?
Exactly. Lower cost, lower profile, but still allowing France to intervene decisively when it chose to.
And they weren't shy about using it, even outside the old French zones, like Zaire.
Giscard d'Estaing's interventions in Zaire in 1977 definitely surprised people. Zaire was former Belgian Congo, not French. It showed France was willing to act as a regional policeman beyond its traditional sphere if it felt vulnerability or its interests were threatened.
But the real test of these security pacts came in Chad in 1982.
Against Libya.
That was critical. When Libyan forces moved into Chad, Mitterrand hesitated initially about a strong French response.
And France's African allies weren't happy.
Not at all. Leaders like Houphouët and Zaire's Mobutu put immediate pressure on Mitterrand. Their argument, according to the sources, was basically, look, these privileged relationships involve reciprocal responsibilities.
Meaning, if France won't step up to protect its allies when they're threatened, then what good are these French security guarantees to us? French credibility was on the line. If they didn't act in Chad, the whole system of bilateral defense pacts could collapse. So France had to intervene to maintain that relationship.
Okay, finally, maybe the most visible legacy. Culture, language.
French is still the official language almost everywhere in the former AOF and AEF, and it's striking that, according to the sources, no major leader, even ones critical of France, has seriously tried to replace it. Mauritania pushing Arabic is noted as the main exception.
And France actively supports this through those cooperation accords.
Yes, providing teachers, funding schools, ensuring French educational standards are maintained so degrees are equivalent. It keeps the cultural and administrative connection strong.
But the sources have an interesting take on how French influence persists through language. It's not necessarily about everyone speaking perfect French.
Right. The argument is that the widespread use of maybe imperfect French, what the source calls mediocre French, or even a kind of Creole patois, might actually be a more effective vehicle for long-term French influence than having just a tiny elite speaking like Parisians.
Oh, so?
Because it means French remains the practical language of administration, of business, of regional communication for millions, even if it's not high literary French. It's become embedded in daily life in a way that's hard to displace. Influence becomes diffused, practical, maybe even permanent.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground, from the sheer brutality of the conquest and the cold efficiency of the exploitation in Black Africa, to the really disturbing ideological hatred driving settler politics in Algeria.
Yeah, the contrast is stark.
And then seeing how these systems evolved into the post-independence era, with things like the CFA franc and the military agreements keeping France deeply involved even after the flags came down.
And that continuity is key. Seeing how that centralized, strong chef model of the colonial governor just morphed into the post-independence presidential systems. It provided stability, maybe, but it wasn't exactly a break from the past. And the sources make that final chilling connection, too, reminding us that the echoes of empire don't just stay in Africa. The descendants, the mindsets of those frustrated Algerian settlers, that colonial mentality, it feeds directly into the support for movements like Le Pen's Front National back in France today. The poison came home.
A really crucial point for understanding contemporary France. Okay, before we wrap up, our final thought for you, the listener, drawing on everything we've discussed. The sources noted France's attention starting to drift away from Africa towards Europe, especially post-war, with European integration becoming the big project. So here's the question. How might France's unique historical baggage being the center of this francophone world actually help or hinder its ambitions within Europe today? Or is its influence in Africa just destined to decline further, no matter what it wants to achieve in the EU?
And it's worth remembering, the sources are clear. France doesn't necessarily face an absolute choice between Europe and Africa, not yet anyway. But the tension, the balancing act between those two spheres of influence where it puts its energy and resources, that's definitely the ongoing story, isn't it? The next chapter.
Something to think about. Join us next time on The Deep Dive.